Imagine stepping into a house where laughter was outlawed. A place where children weren't raised, they were broken. To the outside world, the Marrow family looked like saints. Devout, humble, God-fearing. But behind those locked doors, a ritual of cruelty was unfolding every single night. The neighbors never heard a sound. The church never suspected a thing. But when the truth broke free, it became one of the darkest secrets in America's history. And no, this isn't folklore. This isn't some twisted exaggeration. This is real. A house that became a prison of faith, fear, and torment. Welcome to a buried chapter of history, where the past isn't dead. It's still bleeding beneath the surface. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning. This is the macabre history of the Marrow family of Danvers, Massachusetts, a couple who, for over 2 decades, adopted and birthed children not out of love, but to forge them into weapons of their warped belief system. On the outside, the Marrows were untouchable. They dressed plain, sat piously in church every Sunday, quoted scripture with perfect tongues. Their farm looked ordinary, cornfields swaying in the wind, a red barn, a weathered white house. But locals noticed one thing they could never explain: silence. Dead, suffocating silence. No children's voices. No playful screams. No laughter spilling from the windows. It was as if the house itself swallowed sound. Inside, it was worse than anyone could imagine. The Marrow children lived under absolute terror. Every step calculated. Every word measured. Their father, Elias Marrow, preached one thing: pain was the purifier of sin. Their mother, Ruth, scarred by her own demons, believed suffering was the only path to holiness. Together, they built their own private theology, one where innocence was punished and obedience was bought through fear. The children bore the evidence on their bodies. Some carried scars. Others wore the lifeless stare of souls already shattered. But the walls of horror cracked the day a physician, summoned under false pretenses, stepped into the Marrow home. His name was Dr. Jonathan. And what he saw inside those rooms would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dr. Jonathan Blackwood thought he was answering a simple call. Elias Marrow claimed one of his sons was gravely ill. But when Blackwood stepped inside that house, what he found defied all explanation. The boy wasn't sick, he was scarred by something no illness could cause. His body told a story written in pain, deep welts carved into his flesh, strange ritual burns etched like symbols, and bones bent by repeated violence. Blackwood realized instantly, this wasn't disease. This was ritualized abuse. That night, his leather-bound journal began filling with secrets. Secrets so damning they would one day become one of the darkest records of hidden abuse in early America. The Marrows thought their horrors would remain locked inside those walls forever. They were wrong. But before we plunge deeper, consider this: could you handle a story like this if it happened in your own backyard? This channel isn't for the faint of heart. If you are here, it's because you crave the stories that keep others awake at night. Hit subscribe, join the Mystery Seekers, and tell me, where are you watching from? Back to Dr. Jonathan Blackwood. He had seen suffering before. As a country doctor in rural Ohio, he'd stitched wounds from cave-ins, watched mothers bleed during childbirth, and tended to men crushed under wagons. He had even walked the blood-soaked fields of the Civil War. But nothing prepared him for the horrors inside the Marrow home. It began on a cold autumn morning. Elias Marrow summoned him, claiming a boy had taken a bad fall. Blackwood expected a broken limb. What he found was far worse. The child sat motionless on a wooden chair, his arm twisted unnaturally, bones straining beneath the skin. That alone chilled Blackwood. But then, he saw the boy's back. And that sight nearly rooted him to the floor. It wasn't just injury, it was a canvas of cruelty. Raw welts. Blistering burns. Purple bruises stacked upon one another like brushstrokes in a masterpiece of violence. But the most terrifying part? The boy wasn't crying. He had been trained not to. His lips pressed tight. His eyes hollow. He was silent in his suffering, as if sound itself had been beaten out of him. Behind him, Elias Marrow loomed. A Bible clenched in his fist. His voice low, final, he fell. Blackwood knew instantly, the boy's silence wasn't faith. It was fear. Beside Elias stood Ruth Marrow, still as stone, her face frozen like a statue carved from ice. Blackwood treated the boy carefully, but his mind screamed with questions he couldn't ask. When he whispered, "Did this truly happen in a fall?" the boy's gaze flickered toward his father, then dropped to the floor. That silence told Blackwood everything. That night, unable to sleep, Blackwood opened his journal. His hand shook as he wrote the words. "There is a sickness in that house. A sickness no medicine can cure." From that day forward, every visit became a record. Every detail, every mark, every scream swallowed by silence, etched into his journal. But Blackwood didn't know it yet, his journal would one day be the weapon that destroyed the Marrow's empire of faith and fear. Dr. Blackwood visited again. And again. Each time, he wrote in meticulous detail. The first thing he noticed wasn't pain, it was silence. No laughter. No play. Not even the sound of children bickering. Dozens of children under one roof, and yet the only sound was obedience. They behave, he wrote in his journal, not as sons and daughters, but as captives. Blackwood realized with horror, this wasn't parenting. This was captivity disguised as family. The more he observed, the more dangerous it felt. Elias bent scripture into shackles. "Spare the rod, spoil the child," he intoned, while Ruth enforced it with a switch in her hand. Blackwood saw the truth, these children weren't raised. They were broken. He wanted to speak out, but speaking out here was suicide. The Marrows weren't nobodies. Elias was a deacon. Ruth, a model of piety. Townsfolk called their home, God's house. But Blackwood knew better, it wasn't God's house. It was a prison. "The law here does not serve truth," he scrawled into his journal. "It serves reputation." So his journal became his only weapon. Line by line, he carved the truth into its pages, fractured bones, burned flesh, haunted eyes. Each entry a confession he dared not speak aloud. And then one night, by candlelight, he wrote a sentence so chilling it froze his hand mid-ink. "If the town knew what I know, they would not call it discipline, they would call it slaughter." But here's the question, if Blackwood saw the horror so clearly, how did the neighbors just beyond those cornfields remain blind to it? The Marrow house was no hidden cabin. It stood proudly on the edge of town, white walls, tall windows, a porch swept clean. On Sundays, Elias sat there in his finest black coat. Ruth in lace gloves. The children lined up like a choir. To the neighbors, it looked like order. Discipline. Piety. But order can be a mask. And in this house, that mask was covering terror. When children went missing for days at a time, no one asked why. When the Marrows brought home another orphan, nobody checked the papers. And when those children never seemed to leave, nobody dared to question it. Why? Because Elias Marrow wasn't just a man. He was a reputation. He held the Bible aloft every service, his booming voice silencing doubt with scripture. Ruth played the organ, her hymns echoing through the rafters. To question the Marrows was to question God himself. And in a town built on scripture, that was a line no one dared to cross. But reputation can only hide blood for so long. And soon, the Marrows' empire of silence would begin to crack. But there were signs. Signs so clear they can never be excused. Children spotted with bruises, their eyes darting away from contact. Neighbors swore they sometimes heard muffled cries drifting across the fields on windless nights. One milkman claimed he saw a child in the upstairs window, pale, unmoving. The next morning, that same window was boarded shut. Still, the town looked away. Because to speak up meant making enemies with the most godly family in town. And in small communities, reputation outweighs truth. Perhaps the child fell, they told themselves. Perhaps Elias is strict, but that's his right. Every doubt was smothered. Every bruise excused. Every cry ignored. Dr. Blackwood saw through it all. In his journal he wrote bitterly, "It is not blindness that keeps them silent, it is cowardice." He knew the townsfolk saw enough to suspect. But fear kept them quiet. And silence, in its own way, is a form of consent. And history repeats this same nightmare. When evil cloaks itself in piety, people would rather protect comfort than confront truth. In the Marrow's case, that silence condemned dozens of children to a nightmare that might have been stopped. But what if silence wasn't just fear? What if some in town knew, and chose to protect the Marrows anyway? That's when the whispers began. Whispers of hidden deals. Whispers of secret meetings. Whispers of a town not just complicit in silence, but in protection. By the late 1870s, the Marrows weren't just a family on the edge of town. They were the heartbeat of the community. Every Sunday, their pew in church was filled, front row, as if to remind everyone they stood closest to God. But behind the hymns and handshakes, whispers spread like smoke. In taverns, backrooms, schoolyard gates. Some said Elias Marrow wasn't simply a farmer. Or even a preacher. He was a man with leverage. Elias didn't just read the Bible. He collected secrets, and used them like weapons. Rumors claimed he uncovered private letters, love affairs, unpaid debts, even stolen goods. Secrets that bound townsfolk into silence. And if that's true, then the Marrows weren't hiding their evil alone. An entire town may have been helping them bury it. Some suggested Ruth's charity work with young girls often placed her behind closed doors with the wives of influential men. Whether true or not, the effect was the same. No one dared to challenge her, for fear their own secrets might be dragged into the light. But then came the darker whispers, that certain town elders visited the Marrow home under the cover of night, and not all of those visits were for prayer. Sometimes, voices were heard, deep, low, rhythmic. Chants that sounded older, darker, than the Bible itself. Dr. Blackwood's journal turned frantic here. He scrawled, "This is not neglect. This is collusion. Too many have too much to lose. They would rather sacrifice the children than themselves." Imagine that. An entire town where suspicion wasn't swallowed out of ignorance, but out of fear of exposure. Where those who could have stopped the Marrows wouldn't, because their own hands weren't clean. It's easy for us to say now, "I would have spoken. I would have saved those children." But history proves, when corruption infects a community's heart, even the righteous stay quiet. Silence doesn't just happen. It's manufactured. Bought. Enforced. The Marrows thrived in that silence. And the more they thrived, the bolder they became. What began as cruelty behind closed doors started bleeding into the open in ways the town could no longer ignore. Because once you step inside the Marrow house, the nightmare is no longer rumor. It's real. The first thing you notice isn't what you see, it's what you smell. Dampness, like rotting wood, mixed with something sour. Something human. The wallpaper peels in strips, curling like dead skin. Yet above the hearth, silver candlesticks gleam, a false promise of respectability. The front parlor was a disguise. Every inch beyond it revealed the truth. The hallways were narrow, suffocating, lined with doors that never quite fit their frames. One of them, Elias's study, was locked almost always. Locals whispered that if you pressed your ear to the door, you could hear scratching. Like nails dragged across wood. From the inside. When investigators finally forced it open, they found journals, dozens of them. Some in Elias's neat hand. Others in frantic scrawlings that barely looked human. Pages of scripture, copied over and over. And then, something else. Symbols. Shapes. Words not found in any Bible. The handwriting in those journals broke mid-sentence, dissolving into words that made no sense, phrases that did not come from any Bible, as if Elias's pen was guided by something else. What if those words weren't madness, but instructions? Then came the children's rooms. Small beds lined in perfect rows, no toys, no laughter, just crude wooden frames. In the corner, ropes frayed from use. And on one wall, faint chalk drawings. Stick figures with their faces rubbed out, as though erased in fear, or by force. Ruth claimed she forbade vanity in children, but the drawings whispered another truth: the children had been trying to leave a record of their existence, before it was stolen away. Downstairs, a cellar door groaned open into what Elias proudly called the prayer chamber. But it wasn't prayer that happened there. The stone floor bore stains older than memory. Hooks jutted from beams, and faint circles were carved into the dirt below. Historians still argue, were these rituals of faith gone wrong, or something darker never meant for the light? Dr. Blackwood's diary gave the chilling clue: the children feared the circle most of all. When it was drawn, someone never returned whole. Every inch of the house seemed built not for living, but for control. Rooms too small. Doors too heavy. Locks bolted from the outside. The Marrow house was not a home. It was a machine built to grind innocence into obedience. And in that machine, every scream was swallowed whole. For the townsfolk, those walls provided the perfect excuse: if we cannot see it, perhaps it is not happening. But inside, truth festered. Visitors spoke of pressure in their chest, sudden chills, eyes watching from nowhere. The house itself seemed complicit, as though it had absorbed the suffering and learned to echo it back. And yet, the worst secrets were still buried. What the house hid was terrible enough. But what Elias recorded was worse. Because when the sheriff's men finally forced open Elias Marrow's study, they discovered journals that even hardened investigators refused to read after dark. Neatly stacked on the desk, bundled with twine, were nearly 30 journals. Each bound in cheap leather. Each numbered by Elias's hand. At first, they appeared harmless: daily notes about sermons, descriptions of weather, even grocery lists. But as the pages turned, the handwriting grew darker, the words more frantic, and the journals revealed themselves not as diaries, but as blueprints of cruelty. The words began to shift. Elias's handwriting, once elegant and deliberate, grew jagged, the spacing uneven, as if the ink itself trembled under something unholy. What force guides a hand to write words it does not understand? One entry, dated 1874, read, "The children must not see the sky today. The light makes them restless. The darkness bends their will to obedience." Ruth agrees, though she has not the stomach to watch. She leaves that to me. On another page, a single drawing, a circle scratched over and over until the paper tore. Beside it, Latin words repeated like a chant: conservata, anima libera. Roughly, the flesh preserved, the soul freed. But preserved flesh, at what cost? This was no sermon note. It was a ritual. As the journals continued, the sentences dissolved, words collapsing into strings of letters, as though Elias's hand wasn't his own. Scholars later called it glossolalia, speaking in tongues. Others claimed madness. But some noticed the shapes, mirrored sigils found in forbidden European grimoires. Coincidence? Or proof Elias was invoking something older than Christianity itself? Inside one journal was a folded scrap of paper. Not Elias's hand, Ruth's. Calm, steady, deliberate, the neighbors ask too many questions. I tell them the children are unwell. Their bodies weaken, their skin pales. I cannot look too long without fear of what we've done. Yet Elias says, it is necessary. The Lord will see our obedience and reward us. If I doubt, I sin. Ruth wasn't a bystander. She was a believer. She rationalized, concealed, and in doing so, admitted what Elias never wrote plainly: the children weren't just being punished, they were deteriorating. Their bodies failing. Their spirits breaking. Something inside that house was not just cruel, it was transforming them. One investigator, Thomas Quill, later confessed in a private letter that he burned a journal he had taken. It was not fit for mortal eyes, he wrote. At dusk, I swore the words whispered aloud. To this day, I regret reading even a line. I do not sleep without hearing his voice. Words written by man, that still spoke when the book was closed. The Marrow journals were not diaries. They were part confession, part ritual manual, part descent into madness. And if Elias believed what he wrote, then those children were never his wards. They were sacrifices. Next, we descend into the cellar, the place where sacrifices were prepared, where the house itself seemed to breathe, and where silence was more terrifying than screams. What kind of silence feels louder than a scream? When investigators forced open the trapdoor, the air that rose to meet them wasn't the musty damp of an old foundation. It was sharper, fouler, a stench that clawed the throat and lingered even after retreat. They described it as sweet, but rotten. Not time's decay, but corruption itself. Lantern light flickered as they descended, shadows jagged against stone walls. The cellar was vast, far larger than any storage room. Expanded deliberately, almost like a hollowed cavern. Each step groaned, but the sound didn't echo. It was swallowed. One man swore he heard breathing. Not his own. Not his companions. Something deeper, rhythmic, woven into the air itself. What if the house wasn't holding secrets, but exhaling them? At the bottom, the investigators realized this wasn't a cellar. It was a chamber. The floor bore arcs and circles carved into the dirt, ritual marks worn smooth from repetition. When lanterns shifted, those grooves glinted faintly, like veins of mineral. One man described the stillness as unnatural, like entering a room just after a scream had been silenced. Another swore he felt vibrations underfoot, a faint hum that pulsed with his heartbeat. If walls can echo, can they also remember? Against the far wall stood a crude wooden table, scarred and stained. Above it dangled ropes, braided, frayed, darkened. The men refused to touch them. They already knew the stains weren't soil. Nearby, shelves sagged under jars. At first glance, vegetables, roots, preserves. But inside the cloudy liquid floated things no farmer would store. Fragments of bone. Tufts of hair. Clumps of something indistinct, but once human. When food jars become reliquaries, you are not in a cellar, you are in a shrine. The further they walked from the steps, the colder the air became. Not the cool of stone. A penetrating chill, the kind that prickles skin as though touched by unseen hands. One man whispered that the cellar walls weren't closing in, they were leaning closer, listening. One officer later admitted he felt it, as though someone was standing directly behind him, exhaling against his neck. Yet whenever he turned, only shadow. What if the cellar itself was breathing on them? This was the place Elias had written of in fragments, preparations. He never explained, but the objects scattered across the dirt spoke louder than words. Iron hooks. Shallow basins. A branding iron carved with symbols no priest would bless. These weren't tools of survival. They were instruments, worn, stained, placed with deliberate precision. One man broke. His lantern beam swung wildly as he staggered toward the stairs. Later, he confessed why. For the briefest instant, his light caught the far wall, and there, pressed into the stone itself, was a handprint. Not painted. Not carved. But scorched. What kind of heat burns a hand into stone, yet leaves no ash? The cellar was no passive chamber. It was a stage. And the Marrows had performed their rituals here again and again, perfecting horrors no sane mind could explain. The investigators exchanged no words. They didn't need to. Every jar, every stain, every entry in that ledger testified to the same truth. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't folklore. It was evidence, undeniable, unholy evidence. What happens when superstition hardens into proof? And yet, the cellar still held its darkest secret. Because while jars and hooks told a story of cruelty, they did not explain the faint sound that now echoed through the chamber. A soft drip. A hollow knock. At first, they tried to dismiss it, water seeping through cracks, storm runoff above. But then the sound grew, deliberate. Rhythmic. Almost alive. What if the cellar itself had a heartbeat? One officer steadied his lantern and followed the sound. The light quivered across the farthest wall, stopping on something that shouldn't exist. A seam. A faint vertical line where no line should be. The wall wasn't a wall. It was a door. They pressed their palms against the damp surface. Slowly, the slab shifted, and a gust of stale air burst forth, so foul, it seemed to steal the warmth from their lungs. Behind the cellar was not emptiness, but invitation. A black corridor descended at a sharp angle. The wooden steps, slick with slime, were worn by countless feet. Lantern light revealed carvings etched into the walls, spirals, jagged runes, crosses interlocked in feverish repetition. These were not decorations. They were instructions. And with each step downward, the truth became clear. This passage wasn't hiding something. It was guiding them directly to it. The descent grew heavier, as though the very earth resisted their trespass. Each step down carried the weight of centuries, pressing on their lungs. The deeper they went, the louder the knocking became, until it no longer sounded like water or chance. It was rhythm. It was pulse. It was waiting. What if the heartbeat they heard wasn't their own? At the base, the corridor widened. The men froze. Before them lay a chamber no American farmhouse could ever explain. The room was circular, its floor scorched with a sprawling sigil, vast, intricate, older than the house itself. At its center stood a crude altar of wood and stone, its surface blackened with decades of stains. The smell here was unbearable. Rotting flesh. Iron. And beneath it, a sweetness, cloying, sickly, like spoiled fruit. And then the lanterns caught movement. Against the far wall loomed tall wooden cabinets, their doors half open. Inside, bundles. Small frames wrapped tightly in burlap. Stacked like cordwood. What kind of farmer stacks children like firewood? One sack had torn open, revealing a hand no larger than a doll's. Its skin was grey. Its fingers curled stiff. And then, the knocking. It wasn't echoing from the stone. It was coming from one of those bundles. Something inside was still moving. One man stumbled back, nearly dropping his lantern. Another officer's hand went to his weapon, though he had no target to fire upon. They had uncovered not just the evidence of death, but of the unfinished. Victims meant for ritual, still clinging to the last shreds of life in the darkness. What if the sacrifice wasn't complete? In that moment, every whisper of the townsfolk felt laughably tame. This wasn't cruelty. This wasn't madness. This was devotion. The Marrows weren't killing for pleasure. They were serving. Serving something the scorched sigils worshipped. And as the knocking grew faster, more insistent, the men understood the truth. They hadn't merely uncovered the Marrow family's secret. They had opened its door. What if the true horror isn't what you discover, but what you awaken? Next came the revelation that silenced even the bravest. The lantern flames began to shake violently, though no hand touched them. The air itself seemed alive, pressing in, squeezing their breath. That rhythmic knocking, now unmistakable. It wasn't stone. It wasn't wood. It was flesh. One of the burlap bundles convulsed. Something inside shifted its weight. The sack jerked once. Twice. Then went still. And then, a sound no man there would ever forget. A whimper. Faint. Childlike. What if the voices of the dead weren't gone, but waiting? Dear God, one officer whispered, though his words were swallowed by the suffocating silence. The men froze, lanterns trembling in their hands. The burlap sacks revealed faint edges of human faces beneath the weave, noses flattened, mouths gagged by coarse fabric. Some lay still, sagging like discarded grain. But others, bulged, twitching, betraying a presence that had not yet left this world. What if the bodies you thought were dead, started breathing? Then came the sound, a low, wet inhale. Not from one bundle. From several. The officers staggered back, colliding with the stone walls. These weren't corpses prepared for burial. They were alive. Hidden. Discarded. Left to suffocate in silence. But why keep them breathing? Why not end it quickly? One man's trembling hand brushed the floor sigil. In the lantern glow, the truth struck him cold. The design was incomplete. The ritual wasn't finished. The suffering wasn't a mistake. It was the purpose. What if pain itself was the sacrifice? The knocking grew frantic. The bundles thrashed violently, muffled cries swelling into a sickening chorus. The chamber walls reverberated unnaturally, as if the stone itself was amplifying their torment. And then it happened. The air turned to ice, breath pluming white in the lantern light. The sigil shimmered, faintly glowing along the cracks of scorched stone. What if the carvings weren't symbols, but circuits powering something alive? One burlap sack ripped open with a tearing shriek of fabric. Pale flesh glistened in the lantern glow, a face, gaunt and warped, eyes wide with terror. Its lips quivered, trying to form words, but only a strangled sob escaped. And then the sack dragged inward, pulled not by hands, but by an unseen force emanating from the altar itself. The officers panicked. One dropped his lantern, flames sputtering across damp stone. Another reached for his revolver, though bullets were useless against whatever they had woken. What if the house wasn't haunted, but hungry? The bundles convulsed, cries overlapping into madness. Beneath the chaos rose a new sound, a hum. Low? Guttural. Inhuman. Not from the bundles. Not from the air. From the stone. From the altar. From the earth itself. What if the cellar wasn't a room at all, but a mouth? The men realized the truth too late. It was no longer a cellar. It was a throat. And it was waking up hungry. Next, the ritual chamber reveals its darkest secret, what the Marrows were truly feeding, and why the town above was cursed for generations. The dropped lantern sputtered across the damp stone, flames licking into shallow rivulets. The chamber flickered alive with firelight, and for the first time the officers saw the carvings in their entirety. They weren't scratches. What if every line on the floor was a map, straight into something's stomach? They weren't even words. They were instructions. Circles within circles, runes carved to bite deep into stone. And at the very center, the floor wasn't floor at all. It was a pit. A perfect black void, a hole that reflected no light. What if a cellar didn't lead underground, but straight into something's throat? The flames of their lanterns bent unnaturally toward it, pulled as though by a breath. The whimpers from the sacks grew panicked, the children straining in terror. The stone itself began to tremble, faint, like a giant stirring just below their feet. One officer knelt too close, his eyes wide, pupils swallowing the lantern glow. His lips parted in awe and dread. "It's breathing," he whispered. And it was. Each exhale rose from the pit like damp wind, carrying rot and grave soil. Each inhale tugged at their coats, their hair, even the air in their lungs. What if the darkness could steal your breath before it stole your body? The nearest officer couldn't move. His lantern slipped from his hand, clattering across the stone. Inch by inch, his body tilted toward the void, as if invisible fingers gripped his spine. The other shouted, clawed at his arms, pulling with desperate strength. But the chamber itself wanted him. His boots scraped, his nails split as he clawed the stone, his screams tearing into the dark. And then, silence. No splash. No thud. Just gone. Swallowed whole, as if the man had never existed. What if the ground beneath you could erase someone, like turning a page? The pit had accepted its offering. The sacks erupted in screams, muffled shrieks and thrashing limbs. The runes on the chamber floor began to glow, not fire but something colder, something alive. The officers' hearts hammered. They understood too late. The Marrows hadn't been hiding children. They had been feeding them. Feeding something that still waited beneath. What if the family's darkest secret wasn't murder, but worship? The chamber reeked of burnt oil, of the officer's vanished body, of something older and fouler crawling up from the pit. Yet the most terrifying part wasn't the disappearance. It was the silence that followed. What if silence itself was the proof that something had eaten? That silence trailed them. Out of the cellar. Back into the town. It lingered in every neighbor's lowered eyes, every tight-lipped stare when the Marrow name was spoken. The town had always known. They just never dared to speak it. Next, investigators uncover how far back the pact went, how generations of townsfolk had quietly vanished without a trace, and why every family carried a shadow older than the town itself. What if your own family tree was watered with sacrifice? At first, the officers thought they'd uncovered the darkest secret possible: a single family, the Marrows, gone insane, consumed by rituals too vile to speak aloud. But in the weeks that followed, the truth clawed its way free. What if the Marrows weren't madmen at all, but caretakers? Whispers surfaced of children missing long before the Marrows' reign. Entire families erased from census rolls, struck from church ledgers as though they had never been born. Farmers muttered of night wagons gliding through the valley, no lanterns, no wheels creaking, only the faintest muffled cries. Digging through the county records revealed the pattern: every 2 decades, disappearances in clusters. Always children. Always ignored. What if silence itself was part of the ritual? And the town knew. Not all, but enough. The courthouse, the pulpit, the sheriff's office, the right hands were always dirty. The Marrows weren't monsters hiding on the edge of town. They were chosen stewards of something older than the county itself. It was an unspoken pact. A deal handed down like scripture: the valley would endure, the harvest would thrive, the plagues would pass, so long as the hunger below was fed. What if survival meant sacrificing your own blood? So neighbors learned to stay silent. You didn't ask when a child disappeared. You didn't look for the family who abandoned their farm overnight. You simply prayed it wouldn't be your turn. But silence has a weight. And over decades, it seeped like rot into the marrow of the valley. The Marrow farm was never the source. It was only the heart, the pulse of something much larger. A cycle of sacrifice and denial stretching back to the county's very founding. One investigator traced it to 1793, when the first settlers broke the soil. Entire survey teams had vanished while mapping the land. The journals they left behind described voices in the roots, and a breath that came from nowhere. What if the first stones of the town were laid on top of a mouth? Every generation since had learned the same truth: the hunger never slept. The Marrows were merely the custodians, feeding it when the time came. And then came the coldest realization of all. The officer swallowed by the void in the chamber wasn't the first. He was just the latest. What if the pit hadn't just taken children, but generations of lawmen, pastors, fathers, mothers, erased like names from a book? The void had always been hungry. And the town had always obeyed. They thought they escaped the Marrows, but the hunger followed them home. The men who staggered out of the Marrow farm that night were not the same men who had gone in. Their uniforms hung in tatters, their eyes hollowed by something far worse than exhaustion, and their voices had shrunk to whispers. One officer clutched at his chest as if the air itself had followed him, refusing to leave his lungs. They expected relief when they reached the town, praise, even. Instead, they were met with silence. No headlines, no applause. The sheriff's office, once so eager to expose the Marrow family, buried the report beneath endless layers of paper. It was as if the town had been waiting for them to fail. The officers tried to speak of what they had seen: the chamber, the pit, the man swallowed screaming into the earth, but their words faltered, twisted, broken. The more they tried to explain, the more people turned away. Neighbors averted their eyes, church pews shifted uncomfortably, and even their own families begged them to let it go. But how do you let go of something that refuses to let go of you? At night, the hunger found them again. Each man awoke drenched in sweat, convinced he heard breathing in the dark corner of his bedroom. They dreamed of the pit, of shadows moving without light, of faces pressed against the inside of the earth, mouths forming silent pleas. One officer's wife found him in the yard at 3 a.m., shoveling furiously at the soil. He swore he heard his missing partner's voice calling from beneath the ground. Another refused to step on wooden floors, claiming he could feel it shifting beneath him. The guilt spread faster than the fear. They had saved no one. They hadn't destroyed the chamber. They had only fed it, by surviving. And the Marrows were not gone. Rumors placed surviving family members on the move, spotted in neighboring counties, walking roads at dusk with burlap sacks dripping dark stains. Locals whispered of barns left abandoned, with piles of children's shoes stacked neatly inside, each pair smaller than the last. The message was clear: the hunger would not be denied. Weeks later, one of the officers vanished. His car was found abandoned on a dirt road, the door hanging open, headlights still burning. The tracks in the mud showed he had been dragged away, but there were no footprints. No signs of struggle. No trail. Something had come for him, and it hadn't left a single trace. He wasn't dragged away by men, he was swallowed by the earth itself. The tracks in the mud told the story, deep, unmistakable grooves where something had pulled backward into the soil. The others didn't wait to see more. Some resigned their posts and fled the county. Others drowned themselves in whiskey until they were little more than ghosts. But all of them carried the same truth: once you've heard the hunger breathe, you never stop listening for it. Next, the sheriff's own files revealed a legacy far darker than anyone imagined. When the surviving officers begged him to act, they weren't met with sympathy, but silence. The sheriff sat polishing his revolver, eyes fixed on the floor. Only when the room was empty did he reach into the bottom drawer and pull out a locked box. Inside lay files so yellow they looked like parchment. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, as though the writers had raced to spill the truth before something silenced them forever. The earliest file was dated 1912. It described farmers whispering of sickness in the land, livestock vanishing, infants buried with stones in their mouths, and families who fled overnight, meals still steaming on wooden tables. Every few years, new reports appeared. Missing children. Strange chanting drifting through the tree line. Foul-smelling smoke rising from the Marrow property. And then, without fail, each report was stamped in red ink with one word: closed. Not because the cases were solved, but because they were buried. This wasn't neglect, it was protection. For decades, the sheriff's office had shielded the Marrow family, ensuring their name never appeared in papers, their crimes never reached a courtroom. One file froze the men cold. A schoolteacher in 1937 had tried to raise alarm after several students vanished. Days later, she was found hanging in her classroom. Across the chalkboards, smeared in white dust, were the words, "They belong to the roots." Her death was ruled suicide. Case closed. The deeper the officers read, the more horrifying the truth became. The Marrows had never been a secret. Merchants sold them supplies. Doctors signed falsified certificates. Priests offered absolution in exchange for silence. Everyone in the town had played their part. The Marrow farm wasn't an isolated nightmare, it was a community pact. A cycle of sacrifice that continued, decade after decade. If the hunger stops here, it finds a home somewhere else. Those words weren't a warning. They were a sentence. The sheriff wasn't trembling in fear, he was resigned. For the first time, the officers understood. The sheriff hadn't been fighting the Marrows. He had been protecting them. And that meant no one was safe. Not the survivors. Not their families. Not the next generation. Because hunger doesn't die. It only feeds. Next, the files revealed a truth more terrifying than the pit itself. The Marrows weren't tied to a single farm, a single county, or even a single century. They were a pattern, spreading like infection across the map. The missing persons reports weren't random. Every small town within 50 miles bore the same scars: children gone without a trace, grieving parents silenced, authorities quick to dismiss it all as accidents or runaways. One farmer's testimony in 1949 described bones scattered in his field. Small bones. Snapped. When he reported it to his sheriff, he and his family vanished within days. His name erased from the records. In 1962, a desperate housewife wrote to her sister in another state. Her daughter had disappeared after attending a summer revival meeting on Marrow land. Weeks later, her sister received a final letter, only it wasn't in her handwriting. The note read, "The roots feed us all." Every testimony ended the same way: dead witnesses, vanished families, closed cases. The officers traced the threads and realized the Marrows hadn't just been tolerated. They'd been accommodated. Schools looked the other way when children vanished. Doctors signed falsified certificates. Sheriffs buried their own evidence. The Marrows weren't just a family anymore. They had built an empire, an invisible one, woven from silence, complicity, and fear. But the most disturbing revelation wasn't in the pit, or the rituals, or even the missing children. It was in the files that had survived long enough to be read. Files that hinted the hunger didn't belong to the Marrows at all, the Marrows belonged to it. Entire folders weren't missing by accident. They had been ripped out. In their place, only one thing remained, a symbol scorched into the paper. A crooked root, branching like veins. This wasn't corruption. It was ritual. For decades, entire communities had been feeding the hunger, offering their own in exchange for peace. At first, the officers dismissed it. It sounded insane. Impossible. Yet the pattern was undeniable. Every scar led back to one name, Marrow. And when they asked how such a vast network could exist in silence, only one answer surfaced: silence was safer. No one wanted to be the next family to vanish. No one wanted to be found with stones crammed into their mouths beneath the trees. So they lied. They looked away. They buried the truth. But the officers couldn't unsee it. They weren't facing a single cursed family anymore. They were standing against a system built to protect the curse. And once you stand against a system like that, you either break it, or it breaks you. Next, they risked everything by stepping onto the Marrow property itself. The road to the farmhouse wasn't really a road at all. Just a strip of dirt swallowed by towering trees that turned daylight into twilight. The deputies' tires crunched on gravel, but even that sound seemed muffled, as if the forest itself devoured noise. Then came the smell. Not rot, not quite. It was the metallic weight of blood, soaked into damp earth. The kind of stench that clings to your skin, that showers can't erase. "Do you hear that?" one whispered. But there was nothing. No wind. No birds. No animals. Only silence so deep it hummed. The farmhouse appeared slowly, like a nightmare surfacing from the dark. Its roof sagged. Paint peeled like dead skin. Every window was boarded from the inside. This wasn't abandonment. It was barricade. They parked 100 yards back. None of them wanted to get closer, but duty, and something darker, obsession, pulled them forward. The porch groaned beneath their boots. One tested the door. Locked. Another pressed against a boarded window. Sealed shut. But the house wasn't silent. From deep inside, something was breathing. Inside, they froze. A slow dragging sound echoed, something heavy being pulled across wood. Then silence. The house wasn't empty. It was waiting. One officer motioned. Crowbar in hand, he forced the door. The latch tore free with a scream of metal. The smell hit them first. Not faint anymore, thick, suffocating, like breathing through rotting lungs. It clung to their throats, made their stomachs lurch. Flashlights cut into the black, but the beams dissolved into gloom, as though the shadows themselves were alive. The hallway walls were lined with photographs. Not smiling faces. Not warmth, every face stared wide-eyed, sunken, unsmiling, like the house had captured its victims instead of its family. Children with hollow cheeks. Men with scarecrow-thin necks. Women whose eyes looked already buried. Beneath every frame, carved deep into the wood, the crooked root, branching like veins. "Stay close," one officer muttered. Boots creaked across warped boards until they entered the living room. No furniture. No family relics. Just piles of dirt. Small mounds, toy-sized. Others long, human-shaped. The house wasn't furnished. It was graveyard. The deputy's light shook in his hand. This isn't right. Then it came again. From the back of the house, slow, deliberate footsteps. Weapons raised, hearts pounding. But instead of footsteps, a voice. Soft. Sweet. Almost gentle. Don't be afraid, the shadows whispered back. But it wasn't comfort. It was mimicry. Mockery. Too rehearsed, like luring a child. A beam cut across the floor. A trapdoor. Heavy chains latticed across it, padlocks rusted shut. The dragging sound, they realized, it had come from there. One deputy knelt, gloves shaking, cutting through the brittle locks. They snapped far too easily, like they'd been waiting. Some doors aren't locked to keep you out, they're locked to keep something in. The trapdoor lifted. And the stench rolled out. It wasn't rot, it was breath. A hot, wet exhale from below, rising like something alive. Hardened men gagged. It wasn't just rot. It was something older, deeper, like the earth itself was exhaling death. The cellar didn't smell of decay. It smelled of something still feeding. Flashlights cut down the stairwell. Wooden steps creaked, every groan echoing like a scream. The wall sweated black mold, veins spreading like infection. Step by step, the deputies descended into what they thought was a cellar. It wasn't a basement. It was a crypt. Rows of mounds lined the dirt floor, each draped with canvas, stained dark, the smell unmistakable. Human. They didn't speak. Couldn't. Instinct told them, leave. But duty dragged them deeper. A flashlight swept across stone. Names carved into the wall, dozens, stretching back decades. Some scratched out. Some dated. Fresh names, children's names, the chalk dust still clinging to cracks. The wall wasn't history, it was a waiting list. Then came the dragging sound again. Louder. From deeper in the cellar. They followed. Against every instinct. Their beams landed on cages. Iron bars, welded crude, doors chained shut. Inside, shapes. Small, slumped. At first, bodies. But then, movement. A twitch. A hand. Thin. Pale. Filthy. The graves weren't graves. They were cages. Help, a whisper cracked the silence. A child's hand clawed between the bars. The deputy's blood turned to ice. The dragging sound returned. Now closer. Wet. Breathing with it. In the far corner, something stirred. Too large to be a child. Too misshapen to be human. It wasn't inside a cage. It didn't need one. A deputy raised his weapon, voice breaking. Show yourself. The breathing stopped. Then, behind them, soft, sweet, mockingly calm. Don't be afraid, whispered from the darkness at their backs. The air shivered. Chains rattled. The children whimpered. Flashlights darted. Every cage moved, not naturally, but with jerks, like puppets tugged by invisible strings. The children weren't alone in those cages. Something else was moving with them. One deputy's hand trembled on his trigger. Then the shadow in the corner rose. They came searching for proof. What they found was hunger made flesh. What if the children you tried to save weren't really children at all? The cellar air pressed against their lungs, heavy and damp. Their flashlights trembled as beams slid across the cages, catching movement that wasn't quite natural. Inside, the figures shifted awkwardly, like their bodies had forgotten how to move. Something was wrong. Horribly wrong. One girl sat curled in the corner, hair hanging in greasy ropes, face buried in her knees. Another clutched a broken doll so tightly her knuckles looked bone white. When her eyes finally lifted into the beam, they were too wide, too glassy, too cold. It wasn't the look of a child. The deputies whispered to each other, but none of the children reacted. They didn't cry. They didn't flinch. They didn't even blink at the sudden light. It was as if they'd been trained to stay silent. Then, from the corner, a boy stood. Taller, skeletal, his limbs stretched too long for his frame. He shuffled forward and gripped the bars, mouth opening as if to speak, only a harsh hiss spilled out. His tongue was carved with scars, deep, ragged cuts as though someone had tried to silence him forever. These weren't rescued children. They were broken creations. Every single one bore wounds, twisted bones, blind eyes, bodies that never healed. And yet, in all of them, there was something terrifyingly familiar. The same cheekbones. The same hollow eyes. The deputies felt it before they said it. These weren't strangers. They were all the same blood. The names carved into the walls snapped into place. They weren't victims. They were genealogies. Not adopted. Not kidnapped. Bred. Bred for something the Marrows never wanted the outside world to see. This isn't a family, one deputy whispered. It's a cycle. Then came the dragging sound. Louder this time. Closer. The children shrank back, their glassy eyes darting toward the far end of the cellar. An iron door stood bolted shut from the outside. And behind it, the sound grew, a wet, guttural breathing that didn't belong to anything human. Every nerve in their bodies screamed to run. But duty, obsession, something darker, forced them forward. A deputy placed his trembling hand on the iron bolt. It screeched open. They thought they were saving the children. Instead, they had opened the door to the parent. The door groaned wide. At first, nothing, just blackness. Then, two eyes caught the beam of the flashlight. Not bright. Not human. They glowed. The thing stepped out, dragging itself into the light. Its skin pale and veined, its limbs twisted, its body swollen in places a body should never swell. And yet, its face bore the unmistakable resemblance of the Marrow bloodline. What if the family's darkest secret was never meant to stay hidden underground? The features were unmistakable, carved into its twisted face were the shadows of the Marrow bloodline. Not a child. Not an adult. Something in between. Something bred, not born. The deputies stumbled back, weapons raised, but their hands shook too violently to aim. The thing opened its mouth and the sound that poured out was neither scream nor moan, it was both, a guttural wail that rattled the cellar walls. The children in the cages began echoing it, their voices joining in a sickening chorus. This wasn't a family. This was a system. A system of monsters. The Marrows weren't hiding their children. They were raising them for something. And what they were raising them for reached far beyond the farmhouse. The deputies' beams swung widely until one tripped over a wooden box, half buried beneath sacks of grain. The box wasn't locked. Just dust-caked, waiting. He flipped it open. And the stench of mildew and rot hit him like a wall. Inside were journals. Dozens. Leather-bound, their pages yellowed, their corners stained with time. Every book filled with names. These weren't memories. They were records. March 14, 1921. Eli. Strong bones, pale eyes. Takes well to confinement. July 8, 1934. Sarah. Born weak. Marked for culling. November 2, 1949. Child 6. Male. Unfit. Reuse the mother. The handwriting was meticulous. Cold. Every birth catalogued. Every death noted. Next to certain names, a symbol carved over and over, a circle with a cross through its heart. One deputy, a man hardened by decades of law enforcement, slammed the book shut. His face was pale. They weren't raising children, he whispered. They were raising stock. But livestock doesn't look back at you. The other deputy's flashlight drifted toward the cages. Inside, a girl with clouded eyes stirred, her lips cracked and bleeding. She whispered something too soft to hear. The men leaned closer. Don't open. The words were barely a sigh. But before they could ask, the iron door groaned again, this time on its own. The thing behind it dragged itself closer, its breath heavy, wet, and rattling. The deputies scrambled toward the stairs, panic overtaking training, but it was too late. The bolt screeched. The hinges buckled. And the door swung wide. The creature's head forced itself through the frame, twisting unnaturally as it emerged, its face unmistakably marrow. Sunken pits for eyes. Skin stretched pale and rotting. And behind it, deeper in the shadows, something even worse stirred. What if the monsters in the cellar weren't the beginning, but the result? The features mirrored the photographs hanging upstairs. This wasn't a new creature. It was a descendant. The taller deputy whispered, "There's more of them." His words were confirmed when a second figure crawled into view, smaller, but just as disfigured. Its skin clung tight to bone, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Then another emerged. And another. The children in the cages began to hum, not in terror, but in ritual. A low, vibrating tone that rattled through the cellar. This wasn't panic. This was ceremony. One deputy dropped his flashlight, snatched up the nearest journal, and bolted for the stairs. The other followed, but halfway up he froze. His light caught a wall scrawled in dripping black paint. "Blood stays here." The words stopped him cold. He knew then the Marrows weren't just hiding their bloodline. They were protecting it. The journal he clutched was no family keepsake. It was evidence. A system. A blueprint. One so methodical, so deliberate, that even hardened investigators would later describe it as a private eugenics experiment, decades in the making. The cover was cracked leather, stamped with the initials EM, Ezekiel Marrow. Inside, the ink had faded from black to rusty brown. Yet every word remained sharp, obsessive. Generations catalogued like livestock. Sections labeled, strong blood. Weakness. Unsuitable. Names crossed out. Death dates neatly recorded. Beside some entries, chilling notes, retained for breeding. Cull after delivery. Disposition reused. Every child born in that house was planned. Controlled. Decided before its first breath. Detectives later discovered what the deputies could not: these children never existed in the outside world. No state-issued birth certificates. No baptism records. No paper trails. Only the Marrow's records. A sealed bloodline, locked within rotting walls. But Ezekiel's obsession wasn't just madness. The truth was worse. Hidden photographs inside a trunk showed him standing beside powerful men, local politicians, wealthy landowners, men whose handshakes shaped the county's future. The Marrows hadn't worked alone. They'd been protected. What began as a family secret had metastasized into a network. A web of influence and silence that stretched far beyond the farmhouse cellar. What if the Marrow secret wasn't hidden because no one knew, but because too many people already did? Forensic teams spent days combing through the cellar after the children were rescued. The iron cages dated back to the 1940s, hand-welded, but reinforced with steel from the local mill. The food stores weren't simple farm rations. They were bulk shipments, quietly delivered by suppliers who never asked questions. Beneath rotting potato sacks, investigators found a trapdoor. Below it was another chamber, narrow, windowless, its walls clawed raw. On a shelf, glass jars lined up like trophies, filled with teeth, buttons, and tufts of hair. Each jar labeled with a date. When asked, one surviving Marrow child pointed to them and whispered, "Those are the ones that didn't sing." That phrase would haunt every investigator who ever touched the case. The deeper authorities dug, the clearer it became: this wasn't a tragedy of one family. It was a system. Generations of breeding and culling, echoing horrors usually tied to war crimes. Only here, it unfolded behind white fences and Sunday sermons. The real horror wasn't the cellar. It was the silence. In the next section, a discovery in the county archives revealed how the Marrows stayed invisible, and who helped them. The dusty shelves of Briar County weren't supposed to hide anything. Census books, brittle marriage licenses, fading photographs. Nothing sinister. But when investigators were granted access, they found something that should never have existed. Entire ledgers had been altered. Whole families erased from records. Birth certificates torn from the books. Marriage licenses blotted with heavy black ink. Pages sliced out so cleanly, it looked surgical. The Marrows hadn't just lived in isolation. Someone had erased their very existence from history. Down in the archives basement, an evidence tech unlocked a drawer marked 1950 to 1963, death certificates. Inside were documents never filed with the state. 27 in total. Each tied to infants born with malformations, each marked confidential. And the attending physician was always the same name, Dr. Walter Griggs. The Marrows hadn't acted alone. Someone in authority made sure they could continue. What if the town's only doctor wasn't just complicit, but the architect's ally? Dr. Walter Griggs had been the sole physician in Bryan County during those years. Investigators discovered his training came from a now-defunct medical school, one notorious for its 1930s genetic purity experiments funded by wealthy benefactors. The Marrow program wasn't just madness, it was science disguised as faith. Why would anyone help shield it? The answer came from a single photograph, locked in a courthouse cabinet. It showed Ezekiel Marrow outside the county steps, hand in hand with the sheriff and two local businessmen. On the back, scrawled in a trembling hand, "The project lives on. God's chosen will endure." This wasn't about one disturbed patriarch. It was a belief system. A legacy. When the lead investigator, a veteran of organized crime cases, saw the files, he whispered, "This feels bigger than us." Like it was never meant to surface. And maybe it wasn't. Records had been destroyed, sealed under court orders even federal agents struggled to overturn. For 50 years, someone powerful had worked to make the Marrows invisible. They weren't forgotten. They were erased. Next came the chilling voices of the survivors, the only living proof of what had happened inside that farmhouse. For decades, they were footnotes in censored reports, just names that never spoke. But in the early 1980s, 3 of them, now grown, finally broke their silence. What they revealed wasn't testimony. It was dissent. The first was Ruth Marrow, in her 40s. On deposition tape, her voice cracked every few sentences, as if scar tissue still haunted her throat. She recalled nights when the farmhouse would fall into a silence so heavy, it felt alive. Listening. Then Ezekiel's voice would summon them. The children lined up in the barn, lanterns throwing long shadows across the beams. Ruth said they were forced to prove their devotion. The acts were too grotesque for the court stenographer to record. Transcripts show long stretches marked only, inaudible weeping. Then came Caleb Marrow, one of the few sons who lived long enough to escape. What if survival didn't mean freedom, but carrying the curse? Unlike Ruth, Caleb didn't cry. His words were steady, almost surgical. He described how their father convinced them the outside world was diseased, that they were chosen vessels of God's will. Caleb claimed even the local preacher would sometimes appear in the shadows of the barn, watching, supervising. Yet no official record ever tied that preacher to the case. Then came Caleb's most chilling line, delivered without a quiver in his voice, "We weren't hidden. We were preserved." The barn doors weren't barriers. They were seals. A vault, holding what Ezekiel believed the world wasn't ready to see. The third testimony belonged to Esther, the youngest. She had escaped at just 12, but by the time she spoke, she was frail, soft-spoken, like someone whose childhood had been stolen outright. Esther recalled the cries of babies in the farmhouse, babies she never saw again. When she dared ask her mother where they went, Alma Marrow struck her so hard her lips split open. Then Alma hissed, "Never ask again. They've gone back to God." Her final words silenced the courtroom. The worst part wasn't what they did to us. The worst part was how normal it felt. For Ruth, Caleb, and Esther, family, faith, and love had been rewritten into instruments of control. Their world wasn't broken. It was designed that way. Escaping didn't mean freedom. It meant learning that laughter, hugs, even songs, weren't sins, but life itself. Journalists who later reviewed the depositions admitted their hands shook too much to keep transcribing. Because the Marrow case wasn't just cruelty, it was conditioning. A system that warped children until reality itself bent to Ezekiel's will. This wasn't just abuse. It was indoctrination. And the testimonies raised a darker question: what about the children who never lived long enough to speak? Investigators soon realized there were gaping holes in the Marrow record. A detective sifting through birth certificates from the 1940s to the 1960s noticed something alarming: Ezekiel and Alma had officially registered 15 children. But the journals listed more than double. 7 children registered. Only 8 found alive. Where did the rest go? When authorities raided the Marrow farm, they counted only 8 living children. The other 7 were nowhere to be found. Journalists gave them a name that haunted headlines for years: the Silent Seven. Neighbors swore the Marrows were private but God-fearing. They remembered Alma's swollen belly many times, her silhouette unmistakable. But they never saw newborns leave the property alive. One elderly farmer claimed he once saw Alma carrying a bundle to the barn in the dead of night, lips moving in silent prayer. When investigators searched the barn, they uncovered something darker than murder. Beneath a rotting floorboard lay a small wooden box. Inside were fragments of infant clothing, carefully folded. A porcelain doll with its face gouged out. And beside it, a Bible, the pages fused together with what appeared to be dried blood. Forensic teams scoured the land, but the soil had been turned, reused for generations. If there had ever been bones, the earth had already consumed them. And then came the discovery that froze even the most hardened detectives: Ezekiel's journals. They weren't ledgers. They weren't scripture. They were a manifesto. Page after page, written in frantic strokes, revealed a belief system far more sinister than anyone imagined. In one entry from 1957, Ezekiel scrawled, "The unworthy cannot be raised. Their souls are clean, but their flesh is cursed. We return them to the Lord before their seed can take root." This wasn't neglect. It was ritual. Ezekiel believed some children were born tainted, their lives ended before they could even take their first breath. But horror met law's cold demand: no bodies, no case. Without physical proof, prosecutors couldn't charge Ezekiel or Alma with the disappearance of the Silent Seven. The law required evidence, but the Marrows had perfected erasure. Reporters would later write that these children hadn't just vanished. They were unwritten. As if someone had scrubbed their existence from time itself. Even decades later, no graves were found. Only a lingering truth: the Marrow farm wasn't a home, it was a graveyard without headstones. Every beam, every acre, every splinter of wood held secrets it would never give back. The Marrows weren't monsters hiding in the dark. They were worshipping in the front pew every Sunday. The deeper investigators dug into the Marrow legacy, the clearer the truth became: Ezekiel and Alma never acted alone. They thrived because an entire town chose to look the other way. The first red flag surfaced in the late 1950s, when a county nurse filed a complaint after Alma refused treatment for one of her children. But instead of an inquiry, the case was quietly dismissed. The sheriff didn't protect the child. He protected his old hunting companion, Ezekiel. Because the Marrows weren't just reclusive farmers. Ezekiel stood at the pulpit as a deacon, thundering scripture. Alma's hands graced the church organ every Sunday. To question them wasn't just suspicion, it was seen as blasphemy. Yet behind closed doors, whispers grew. A doctor noticed signs of malnutrition and genetic illness in several children. He wanted to intervene, but the sheriff warned him, best not to stir up trouble. The Marrows take care of their own. This wasn't neglect. This was protection, by the law, by the church, by the very fabric of the community. Church elders dismissed every accusation as an attack on faith. Neighbors who complained of the cries echoing from the barn at night were told it was spiritual warfare. The pastor urged them to pray instead of meddling. Years later, journalists uncovered church records showing that part of the Marrow farm's 1940s expansion had been funded by church money. Framed as God's mission to raise many children, it was nothing less than an investment in horror. One reporter would later describe it bluntly: the Marrow crimes weren't hidden by silence. They were baptized in it. Every attempt to expose the family was smothered. Witnesses were pressured into recanting. Case files vanished. A deputy who questioned the missing infants was reassigned to traffic duty in another county. Others who spoke out were quietly shunned, branded liars, or worse, accused of blasphemy. And then came the cruelest tragedy of all. Some of the surviving children, bruised and trembling, tried to report the horrors once they escaped. But when they staggered into town, filthy and broken, they weren't treated as victims. They were dismissed as rebellious. Some were even told they were possessed. The same hands that should have protected them turned them away. And in that rejection, the Marrow's reign of terror stretched on, long after the barn doors had closed. The people who should have saved the Marrow children were the same ones who drove them back into Ezekiel's grasp. By the time authorities finally raided the farm in the late 1960s, decades of chances had already slipped away. Dozens of lives destroyed, not because no one knew, but because the town chose loyalty over truth, faith over justice. The haunting question isn't how did this happen? It's who did the community truly not know, or did they simply not want to? The raid should have been the ending, but for the Marrows, it was only the beginning of their legend. The surviving children were placed in state custody. Ezekiel was arrested. Alma was dragged away in a daze, clutching her Bible so tightly her fingers bled. The farmhouse was emptied, padlocked, and left to rot. A year later, its remains were burned in a massive bonfire. Officials called it cleansing, healing. Yet not a single prayer was spoken over the flames. The silence said more than words ever could. For a time, it seemed the nightmare was over. But evil doesn't stay buried. Drive down the dirt road today, and they say your headlights flicker near the edge of the old field. Locals whisper of faint sobbing in the wind, like children calling for help. Others swear they've seen pale, thin figures darting between trees, the same distorted faces once described in police reports. Then came the records. After the Marrow's arrest, at least 6 additional children appeared in the birth registries. Children with Marrow blood, who were never found. Some believe they were buried in the fields. Others fear they were hidden, raised under new names, cursed to carry the family's shadow into another generation. The town tried to erase the Marrows. Instead, their silence carved a scar that never healed. The church that once shielded Ezekiel now stands abandoned. Its windows shattered, its pews rotting with dust. Teenagers dare each other to spend the night inside, most don't last till dawn. They claim they hear faint hymns drifting from the rafters, the same song Alma once played on the organ. Former neighbors rarely speak of the family. "We don't talk about that name," they mutter. One elderly resident, when pressed for a documentary, finally said it plainly: Ezekiel's dead. Alma's gone. But evil like that doesn't die. It lingers. That's the legacy of the Marrow family. Not just a tragedy, but a warning. Their story wasn't about one monstrous man or one complicit woman. It was about an entire community that turned away until it was too late. A warning about blind faith, silence, and fear. The farmhouse may be gone, but the soil remembers. And those who wander too close still feel it, a chill in the air, a whisper on the wind, and the sense that something, or someone, is watching.